We are going to now touch on Unit 3. Hopefully this lighting works okay. It's totally annoying to me, but hopefully you can see me. Unit 3 is about senses, our bodily senses, and we're going to take a look at them and see what that has to do with the paranormal. So let's just first start with the fact that, obviously we have 5 senses, and I would think maybe I can ask the group here which you think is the most important sense and why. Perhaps we can talk about that for a second. I'll just, since I'm here alone giving this video, I will say that the general consensus is that our sense of vision is generally considered the most important sense, the most powerful sense, probably gives us the most access to data. It's probably the most informational sense that we have. So that could be debated, but it's not worth debating. Let's just spend a few minutes talking about the vision sense and how it works. The way it works is photons come from the sun or come from a light bulb or come from wherever, and they bounce off of objects. They're redirected to our eyes. They pass through the front of our eye, through our opening in the eye, which is the pupil, which shuts down or opens up depending on whether there's a lot of light or a little light, and it shines onto the back of our eye, hits our retina. Those cells in the retina, rods and cones, detect light intensity and light color and are connected to the brain via the optic nerve. Nerves are essentially electrochemical devices and pass electrical signals from the back of the retina into the visual cortex in our brain. And so that's how it's wired. The question is, you kind of get the impression that you're a little person sitting inside your head looking through your eyes at the world. And that although that's not the way it's happening, it's the way it feels. Actually, I want to get into a little bit more detail as to how this works to show you that it's actually quite different than that in lots of different ways. But I think the best metaphor to use is a movie screen. What we're seeing, it's as if we're looking at a movie screen where the image of the world is projected on the screen. And so we'll just sort of think of that metaphor as we go along. So somewhere, let's equate what I just described. Let's compare that, I should say, with say how a TV works. So you've got a camera, a TV camera, and photons go into the camera. They go through a lens. They strike a light-sensitive surface, which is a photodetector, and it detects colors and intensities. It encodes that information, sends it over radio waves. They get to the other end, they get decoded, and they get translated through some mechanism. It's a video card in a computer. They get all those ones and zeros, all those bits of information get translated into an information stream that can run to a display device, let's say a television monitor. And once it hits a television monitor, little red, green, and blue dots on the screen are illuminated at different intensities and can display a scene. Colors are created by red, green, and blue. The different intensities of red, green, and blue can create all the different colors that you can see on the TV. So actually, there's not really too much of a difference here between how our visual sense works and how, say, a TV works. There's a photodetector at one end, there's information, and then there's some device at the other end illuminating some sort of a screen with a scene on it. Here's the important thing to keep in mind, is that the information that's going across that wire or through the airwaves or down our optic nerve into our brain, that information contains no visual attributes. In other words, let's say you were looking at a bright red apple. If you were to hack into the optic nerve, There's nowhere you could find red in any of the signals going down the optic nerve, right? The quality of red doesn't exist in that optic nerve. All it is impulses, waveforms, and it goes into the brain, and something in the brain takes that information and does some sort of conversion and creates what philosophers call the qualia, the quality of red. That's actually created in your mind. That doesn't exist in your eye. It doesn't exist in the signal in the optical nerve, in the optic nerve. All right? And again, depending on the scientist or the philosopher you talk about, it doesn't even exist in the real world. This is getting beyond ourselves a little bit, but there are real philosophic discussions as to whether colors even exist in our world, as opposed to existing in our mind, where they're expressed via some mechanism in the brain. What are we getting to? What we're getting to is that this image that you see in front of you right now, this image is being created somewhere in you, somewhere in yourself. Call it your brain, call it your mind. And there's a screen that you're looking at, not a literal screen, but a figurative screen, that where all of this information is being projected. Okay? There's work being done by you to create this. It's not a passive process. It's not like literally there's a hole and you're looking through the hole. You're inside your head and you're looking through the hole and you see the scene. The scene is being constructed by you and being projected onto your internal screen by you. And you may disagree with that, but just sort of be patient. So, the reason I'm spending so much time talking about you creating the image is that today, being awake, opening your eyes and sitting here and looking at this scene, it's quite obvious that the scene that you're creating represents the scene that is in front of you, and is directly related to the photons that are going into your eyes, right? So the scene you're creating, theoretically, is an accurate representation of what's sitting in front of you. But consider the scenario where you're dreaming. You're asleep and you're dreaming. Your eyes are closed. In that scenario, obviously, there is no light going into your eyes. There is no scene in front of you that you're projecting. But the scene that you're actually seeing, and I'll say seeing in quotes because you're not using your eyes to see it, but the scene that you're seeing while you're dreaming is indistinguishable from the scene that you see when you're awake. For those of you who don't recall their memories very accurately or very vividly, you may argue at that point. You may simply say, I don't know whether that's the case because I don't remember my dreams. We're going to get into a whole segment discussing dreams, and so we'll talk to those people. But for those people who can remember their dreams and who have had particularly vivid dreams, you'll remember that the visual nature of that dream is really indistinguishable from the visual nature of real life. In some cases, the visual nature of the dream is actually more defined, more realistic than life. But again, we'll get into that discussion when we talk about dreaming. So the real point here is that your human body, or maybe not your body, I shouldn't use the word body, your human self, your human entity that you inhabit, seems to be able to create a visual scene based on information being received through your eyes, but it can also create just as accurate, just as real a visual scene in a dreaming process. So it obviously, the process of seeing and the process of vision does not actually require eyes. It does not actually require photons and an optic nerve and a retina, etc., etc. So I guess the other thing I would mention now, I guess now is as good a time as any to mention it, is that The question is whether you think that there are two completely different mechanisms that humans possess to create vision. One mechanism is you look at it through your eyes, and your internal screen is projected by whatever the eyes send you. And there's a completely other mechanism that's possible in a human, and that is that you can create your own vision somewhere in your mind, somewhere internally. But it lights up the exact same screen. I would suggest that we probably only have one facility for vision, and the facility is as I'm describing, which is visual information is constructed internally. And there's no such thing as simply seeing through your eye and having that go directly to a screen. It's all being created. The only difference is, just like a TV where you've got a cable input and an antenna input and a VCR input and multiple inputs, just like that's the case, what I'm suggesting is that our visual sense has two different inputs. One is a creative input that can be provided completely internally, and the other is an input that probably is being created internally, but is being fed by data that comes through the eyes. And let me give you a couple of reasons that I think substantiate this. First of all, there are lots and lots of accounts of people who have had near-death experiences and other mystical experiences where they are either unconscious, dead, or in whatever sense are unable to use their eyes, that have completely capable visual senses. But very often these people, like for example in the case of Eben Alexander, the neurosurgeon from Boston who had a near-death experience, very, very famous near-death experience, which we'll talk about again some other time. But he described a special kind of vision, which is 360-degree vision. In other words, rather than just seeing 180 degrees of what's in front of him, he was able to see his complete surroundings with his vision. And that actually makes sense. If you have this vision processing capability somewhere in you that can take either visual information from your eyes or visual information through some other source, it's quite reasonable to think that when it's coming from your eyes, what you're going to only see is 180 degrees, because that's the only information your eyes can see, is what's in front of you. But if you're seeing without your eyes, if you're seeing, through this other facility, it's perfectly reasonable to think that the data internally that's being generated for that construction of data could generate data for a full 360 degrees. And so it's quite possible that if we talk about the projection screen that's inside of you where this vision is being projected, that the projection screen actually goes all the way around. It's a 360-degree screen. But during your waking hours, when you're seeing normally, you're only illuminating the front 180 degrees because that's the only visual information that's coming through your eyes. Okay? So, I've got to give you the opposite side of the story here. I do have some more examples I want to give you of sort of odd constructions of vision, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let's put that aside just for a second and talk about, well, what's the scientific view of vision? So how does a scientist explain dreaming, vision during dreaming? Well, basically the way they explain that is your vision is being, in that particular case, you're actually creating the scene and you're activating the visual cortex directly, as if it was coming from the eye. So basically what they're saying is that the brain is essentially simulating the scene. And basically what it's doing is it's reaching into memory, it's getting the information, and it's applying it to the visual cortex as if the information was coming from the eyes. So essentially what they're saying is there's two ways to see. One is when you're awake, information goes directly from your eyes to your brain, and when you're asleep, information is pulled out of your memory, and somehow the brain has a facility where it can take that information and encode it in whatever way is necessary to apply it to the visual cortex, and the visual cortex can represent it as a visual scene. For me personally, I'm pretty underwhelmed by that description, and I'm not so sure that it's provable that that's how it works. Not that my theory is provable that much either, although my theory comports with the data a little bit more. And let me tell you why. Besides people being in a out of conscious or unconscious or near-death state or whatever state, if they're in a state where their normal visual sense isn't working but they can see visual scenes, very often it's 360 degrees, as I said. But there's a whole bunch of other cases that are strange as well. Whether it's 360 degrees or 180 degrees, there are, for example, there are situations that are hard to explain, where we actually can see information that's partially being provided by our eyes and partially being provided through some internal mechanism. And this sort of combination, this sort of multi-input, multi-experience vision isn't really explained by science. And so what I'm talking about is, for starters, hallucinations. People have hallucinations. Sometimes it's drug-induced, sometimes there are lots of things that can induce hallucinations. But the point is, a hallucination is typically something unreal set in a scene that is real. And that's actually the difficulty, is the person has a hard time figuring out what's real and what isn't, what's coming through their eyes and what's not coming through their eyes. So hallucinations are visual experiences that combine the external and internal sources, the external and internal inputs. There's a syndrome that you can Google. It's called Charles Bonnet syndrome, B-O-N-N, or Charles Bonnet syndrome, B-O-N-N-E-T, that is literally saying that people see things that aren't there. Similar to a hallucination, but it's really sort of a mental syndrome as opposed to some sort of a drug-induced temporary situation. So Charles Bonnet syndrome, look that up. Ghost sightings. People see ghosts. People do report seeing ghosts. They report seeing family members or apparitions or whatever. But what they see is set against what's really coming through their eyes. And, scientists have said for many, for decades, hundreds of years, well, they set up cameras and other ways to see if they can verify or validate that someone saw something, and in most cases they can't validate it. In some cases they can. So in some cases they have actually found sort of visual proof that some of these strange occurrences happen, but in most cases they don't. Well, my point really is that doesn't mean that something odd isn't happening, because it's possible that someone is picking up or sensing something that doesn't involve photons at all. It's real, but it's somehow entering the person's visual system other than through their eyes. And the type of mechanism I'm talking about would allow for that kind of thing, where you could take data and express it within your visual sense without having it come through your eyes. I've got a story of my own to tell you about that, but that'll have to wait for a minute. Biblical accounts. I'm not a big believer in most of the stories in the Bible, but I do believe that some of them probably carry grains of truth. The burning bush story, for example. Maybe that was a real thing. On the other hand, maybe it was real, but maybe it had nothing to do with photons. So, perhaps some of these biblical accounts are sort of mystical things being superimposed on physical visual field. End-of-life experiences. There's lots of cases where doctors and nurses have watched patients die, and as soon as the patient has died, they refer to it as a fog-like substance lift out of that body. And there's never been any photographic evidence of that, but there's been eyewitness accounts, many, many, many eyewitness accounts of this happening. Well, the kind of visual mechanism that I'm talking about would explain this sort of thing. So I just said, well, there's lots of examples of this sort of thing. Well, they're called optical illusions. Go on the internet and Google optical illusions and take a look at some of the incredible optical illusions that are available. Some of the there's uncountable numbers of optical illusions, but there's a whole a class of optical illusions that compare shapes and colors, what you're perceiving versus what in actuality they are. And a lot of these share a similar trait, and the trait is that your brain is used to seeing certain colors together and is used to seeing a color and then another variant of that color as a shadow of that color. And so there's lots of optical illusions that you can create that can trick your mind into thinking that it's seeing a certain object or a certain color or a certain shape, because that is the color or the shape that it would expect to see in the normal world. And so basically what we're saying is that your brain is taking information in, or your mind is taking this information in. It isn't just, I said, 20 minutes ago, there's a conversion that goes on somewhere in your mind where this information is presented to a screen. That conversion also involves a whole interpretive process where it's making some assumptions, it's comparing what you've seen before with what you're seeing now, and trying to equate the two, right? And a lot of optical illusions are thought to be created in that way, where information comes in that is one type of information, but in some ways it's very similar to something that you would see on a normal everyday basis. So your mind takes that information and it actually converts it to match what you would normally see in real life, and that's what's displayed on your screen, right? And if it was a direct connection between your eye and your optic nerve and your visual cortex, that conversion wouldn't happen. Well, it's not a direct connection, is what I'm saying. Yes, of course, there are physical nerves that run to physical places in your brain, but I'm just saying the visual process is much more complicated than data in, data out. Data into your eyes equals the data that goes onto the screen. That is absolutely not what happens. Okay? So optical illusions give you a whole bunch of examples of the types of things that I'm talking about. And again, there's not enough I could spend hours just talking about optical illusions, and so obviously I can't do that. So I would suggest that if you're interested in that aspect of things, Google optical illusions, take a look at a few yourself. A couple more stories just to illustrate this. My aunt was in a very, very, very late stage of cancer, of a cancer, and she was in her bedroom, and her daughter was there talking to her, and they were talking about whatever they were talking about, and my aunt noticed a man standing in the corner, and she commented about the man standing in the corner, and of course my cousin couldn't see that man. My aunt insisted that there was a man there. My cousin insisted that there wasn't. And I don't know how hard my cousin pushed back, but when she told me this story, weeks later, she told me that she told her mother that, no, Mom, there's really nobody there. Well, after a while, my aunt was a bit fatigued and thirsty, and so my cousin went to get her a glass of water. And as so many times it happens this way when people pass, is that they pass during that little short period of time when there's no one there to watch. And that's a whole other area maybe of discussion that is a whole part of our psychology, apparently, that we kind of want to do that in private, I guess. Anyway, so my cousin comes back with a glass of water. My aunt is dead. But there's so many stories out there in the literature that talk about a loved one coming to take someone across through the death process. And of course, if you were to talk to a materialist about that, you would simply say that the person is fatigued and maybe hallucinating and imagining that they're with their friends and their family because that's something that gives them comfort, right? You would simply They would simply say that that's something that the patient wanted, so that's what they imagined. But there's a lot of these stories of a mother coming to get a child, or a wife coming to get a husband, or a friend coming to help a friend in the transition. Just a couple of comments. One is we're talking about vision right now, and so we'll leave those other issues aside, and we'll talk about those things when we talk about near-death experiences and shared death experiences. We'll talk about those ideas of the death process. But what I'm really talking about here is, think about my aunt's sense of vision. Imagine she was actually seeing a man in the corner. Imagine that she was seeing someone in the corner who was not physically there. Imagine how that would work. And what I'm saying is, using the kind of vision that I'm talking about, which is how I believe our vision actually does work, where it's a construction of our selves. We actually create this construction, and this construction does not just consist of photons coming through our eyes. You would easily have the kind of experience that she had, where the man was just as real to her and was in her field of vision just as much as the wall and the windows and the bed and all the other objects in the room. The objects would be indistinguishable because they were being created by the same facility at the same time. And we'll get into the death experience at some other time. Another quick illustration here, and this involves myself personally, and it actually involves some things that we're really going to get into later, but I just want to touch on this one aspect of it. There is a whole area of science, paranormal science, that involves meditation, relaxation, and astral projection. And when I say astral projection, I'm talking about leaving your body, out-of-body experiences. And we're going to get into that later, but there's a tool that you can use called HemiSync, where you wear a set of earphones and you listen to certain types of sounds. And the idea behind the sounds is that it synchronizes the two halves of your brain in such a way that it can facilitate out-of-body travel. And I was playing around with that stuff one time through a bunch of experimentation, and I was lying on a bed in the middle of the day, eyes shut, but totally wide awake and totally conscious. I was just had my eyes shut and listening to one of these CDs. And all of a sudden, I was listening with a little battery-powered CD player. And all of a sudden, there's sound, but there's also a voice, sort of it's kind of like a guided meditation. So there's a woman's voice talking. Oh, sorry, a man's voice talking. And all of a sudden, I started hearing a lot of static on top of the voice. I could hear the voice in the background, but very, very, very loud static. Also, and I'm listening. I'm lying there listening, going, "Oh man, the batteries are dying. This is, this is driving me crazy. I'll listen for a minute and see if I can kind of get through this." So I'm kind of trying to concentrate, kind of trying to listen, and all of a sudden, my eyes are shut. But all of a sudden, I see a green. The upper 2/3 of my visual field was a perfectly formed green rectangle. Very, very interesting shade of green, a bright but deep, glowing green, perfectly consistent color, no variation whatsoever. It could have been a test pattern for a TV or something. Just a beautiful green and a perfect rectangle. I'm lying there listening to this static, listening to this voice, and watching this green rectangle, and finally, I just say, the heck with this. I'm going to, there's obviously something wrong with my CD player. So I open my eyes, the green goes away. I take my headset off. I check the batteries. I've got a battery meter, and I check the batteries. They're perfectly fine. I can't find anything wrong with the player. I put my part of my headset up to my ear and play again. It's perfectly fine. There's no buzzing. There's no problem. And then, of course, I'm thinking, wait a second. So first of all, there's nothing wrong with the player. There's nothing wrong with the batteries. My headset plug was not loose. So there's nothing wrong here. So I shouldn't have been getting the static, but forget about the static. What the hell's going on with this green thing? And I'm thinking about it. I was like, okay, so what could possibly happen? What could possibly happen in terms of listening with my ears that would cause this perfect green rectangle to appear in front of my eyes? Well, there's a whole other part of this story that explains what was going on that I'm not going to get into right now. I'll get into in a later discussion, so be patient on that. The point is, my visual, something lit up my visual facility. So I'd see this perfect green rectangle. And all I'm really trying to get to is that all of that information that you see is being constructed by yourself. And this is just one more example of it. And I'll tell you more about the rest of the story when the time is right. So, to me, it is very, very clear that we create our own visual sense. Yes, we do gather information from around us, and our eyes is one of the places that we get some of that information from, but that the rest of the sense is really built up by us through some internal facility. But that's just one sense. What about the other senses? Well, another really prevalent sense is our sense of touch, our sense of feeling. And go on Google and take a look at Googling for false limbs. And what you'll find is people who have had amputated limbs still feel the limb. They feel pain in that limb. They have itching in that limb. So their mind, there's, and this has really been, validated by, hard science, that your mind creates a body image, and that body image, for a regular whole person, that body image pretty much matches your actual body. So I have a body image that thinks that I have an arm that comes down and has fingers at the end, and in fact I do. And if I shut my eyes and move my arm around, if I look at something and shut my eyes, I can reach over and I can grab it, because I have a body image that knows how long my arm is, even if I can't see it. And it's true that I even have that even if I don't have the arm, is that I can still have that body image. There are experiments that have been done where they have created prosthetic limbs to go over your normal limb, and your prosthetic limb is slightly longer than your normal limb. And over time, they'll make it slightly longer still, and slightly longer still. And you can slowly change your body image. So you can actually change your body image so that your mind thinks that your arm is 5 feet long instead of whatever it is, 2 feet long. And that you really have a sense. If you shut your eyes and if you just try to imagine and feel your body, your arms feel much longer than they really are. So this sense can be manipulated artificially. And it's been done, it's been tested, and it's been proven. They've even done tests where, and if you go in and look at false limbs, where if you take a person and you have them put, let's say, their right arm under the table, and you create a false arm and you put it on the table. And you have them look at that false arm, and you have someone take like a little brush, and I've seen these experiments and they're really amazing. You take a little brush and you brush their fingers just so that they can feel that sense on their fingers. But while you're doing that, you have a different person brushing their real fingers. So they're sitting there looking at the fake hand, and they know it's a fake hand. But what happens is you end up convincing their mind, convincing their brain that hand is theirs, even though it's not. And the way you do that is by brushing the fake hand at the same time as brushing the real hand out of their sight. So visually they're looking at this fake hand, and after a short period of time, their body adjusts to the point where they believe that that's really their hand. And then there are further experiments that they can do on that fake hand, and that person will be convinced that it's really their hand. And of course, in one of these tests, eventually they take a knife or a hammer and smash the hand, and the person freaks out and feels pain in the hand when really nothing happened to their hand at all. So, I guess all I'm really getting to is there's lots of senses involved. These senses aren't quite as hardwired and obvious as you think. These things are very subtle things. You have a body image that can be changed. You can be fooled into thinking that a limb is yours when it's not really yours. You can fool yourself into thinking you still have a limb that you actually don't have. These are very, very complex interactions and not quite as straightforward as you might think. One last comment I would make about the visual sense is that there are examples of people who, a couple of different things. First of all, there are examples of people who have no vision, and it was a repairable problem. In other words, I don't know whether it was a break in the optic nerve or somehow surgically this lack of vision could be repaired surgically. And in at least one of these cases, when the surgeons reconnected the wires and vision was restored, the patient was really upset. It really kind of freaked out. And the reason was because the information being provided was completely foreign to the patient. Apparently, it was just a jumble of sensations that the patient had no concept of how to deal with. And imagine it. Imagine what you open your eyes and you see a scene and it all makes sense to you. What you don't really understand is that imagine if you had never seen before and all of a sudden you opened your eyes and you saw something. That would be a very foreign experience. So we shouldn't take vision as this obvious thing where, the first time you open your eyes, you see this scene and you understand what it is. It's really can be a complex, foreign thing. And the whole idea of vision is it may be a very learned process. Maybe something you need to sort of get used to and figure out. And in the case of this person who had their eyes fixed, maybe what they were seeing is the actual raw impulses that were coursing down the optic nerve and going to that visual cortex. And that information is completely indiscernible. Maybe the facility of constructing a visual scene had never really been developed in that person because they've never had to use it. And so those first few days when they were seeing, what they were seeing is just raw electrical impulses and it made no sense. Over time, they were able to see like a normal person. There's probably a lot of insight into what was going on with that person, and maybe it has some implications on how vision actually works. I don't know. I'm just sort of throwing it out there that vision isn't like a cable that you plug in with TV and all of a sudden you get vision on the TV and everything's cool. There's a whole process, apparently, of a human kind of understanding what vision is and learning about it. One last thing that I think is very interesting is that there are cases where patients who are blind have had near-death experiences. One particular one that I have in mind was she was in a hospital and this woman had been blind for many years, maybe forever. Maybe she may never have had sight, but she had a near-death experience and she was able to, or an out-of-body experience, one or the other, but she was able to completely describe her surroundings. She was able to describe the color of the cars out on the street and the light poles and, the entire scene. And there were two really sort of incredible aspects to her story. One part of the story is that she didn't know what vision was, although she was able to describe that she could actually see. So there was some visual facility that she had. Theoretically, she shouldn't have had the ability to imagine what a car looked like or what a street light looked like, because she'd never seen one before. But she was able to see it and describe it from within when she awoke from her experience. Second amazing sort of aspect to a story like this is she had been transported to this hospital with whatever her problem was to be taken care of, and she was blind when she was transported to the hospital in an ambulance. But she was able to describe the entire visual scene around the hospital after this experience happened. And it wasn't possible for her to know what all this stuff looked like because she was blind when she got there. So it was a totally new thing to her. So number one, her facility of vision when she was blind to begin with is unexplainable. How would she even know what vision was and what the experience of vision was like if she had never had vision? And number two, if an out-of-body kind of experience is impossible, which most scientists say it is, how was she able to describe the actual physical surroundings of the hospital after this experience when she never had seen it before the experience? So, sort of a two for one, two amazing aspects of one experience. And we're going to talk a lot more about out-of-body experiences, how to have them, what they mean, what they're like, what might explain them. That's a whole other conversation we're going to have. That pretty much wraps up our conversation about vision and about our senses. I think the takeaway from this unit is the following. I fully believe, and maybe I've given you enough information to start maybe accepting, that the experience that we have is an experience that we construct, that we actually create our world experience within us. And so go back and look at the first couple of units that we talked about. We talked about the fact that somehow human beings, with our intention, can actually change the physical world. We can change those balls falling down that peg wall. We can change them to go right or left. We can change we can change the occurrence of medical records, of medical tests that have happened many years ago, just through our intention. So that gives you a sense that we have an effect over the world that we don't even realize we have. And what I'm saying here in this unit is we also construct the experience of our world within ourselves. We construct a body image. We construct a limb. Even if we don't have a limb, we construct one. And we construct our own visual scenes internally with some facility within ourselves. So not only do we have effect over our world, what I'm saying is we actually create the experience of our world within ourselves. Okay? The next section we're going to get into is going to talk about consciousness and dreams. And maybe we'll get a little more chance to talk about we'll flesh out more about dreams. We've talked about it a little bit, but now we're going to flesh it out a lot more so that we can understand how dreams work and how that relates to consciousness. So until next time.